fervent pace of new teachers and teachings coming to light, but still some confusion about the true purpose behind teaching them and offering them to others.
Is it possible to articulate the mechanics of that practice now, or is this something that humanity isn't quite ready for?
We could articulate the mechanics, certainly, but remember, the actual process might differ between individuals because ultimately, Kundalini awakening, while it's placed in the pineal gland, has very little to do with the pineal. There are electromagnetic sensitive connections between the pineal and all other chakras that illuminate when Kundalini rises, but the Kundalini essentially sits at the seat of the soul, where the root and the sacral come together, where that powerhouse of breath and energy meet. So raising the Kundalini actually has more to do with a tantric type of intimate and sexual connection that you are making within yourself, where you begin to access the material and physical components of very orgasmic light. And this isn't a manipulation necessarily. We have many ask us this oftentimes. Is this a sexual practice where there should be some type of physical manipulation in order to achieve it? And this was not the case at all in our day. In fact, doing this would diminish the energy because it's far more powerful than that. For us, it involved pulling the energy up from the perineum, bringing it up in such a way that it would expand into our sacral and we could tangibly make it rise. Not in a forceful way. We're not attempting perfection here, but we're getting into a state where the breath becomes the channel through which our energy rises. And as we pull the feeling of it up, we are eventually moving our body and our spirit and our mind into a state of coherence. To us, it's a state of quantum presence where we are no longer physical beings at all. As we're moving that sensation, we'll call it, that orgasmic elixir and sensation from the seat of the soul upward through the chakras, we eventually reach that electromagnetic center in the pineal, which illuminates a part of the brain. It begins to stimulate hormones. It's a godlike elixir that, as it rises through the crown, pours over us like manna from heaven. We begin to feel as if we are coated actually in a golden light. Now, many who have Kundalini awakenings do so in a very rigid and we would say even painful way. And it's because they have forced the energy too quickly, or they've had a spontaneous, we'll call it Kundalini awakening, that perhaps their soul was ready for, but the body that existed in a different dimension couldn't handle. And we know these can be very difficult to assimilate. And this is why in our civilization, we were never taught to force or to raise it through a very active breath. What we notice people doing today is doing a very rapid Kundalini breath called the breath of fire. And while this breath has a purpose and is very supportive in the body's alchemy, it isn't the type of breath we are going for when we want to raise Kundalini. We want to do it slow. We want to channel it in such a way that we feel as if it is a part of us. It's a natural part of us rising with the breath. And then we get to the point where it can become one with us in any moment. And this is what many of us achieved. So the mechanics of it, they really exist within the chakra system, within the sexual organs, and within the brain. And using them together through a meditative practice, we are able to raise the Kundalini.
Now, you mentioned the perineum, so would we be pulling up on the perineum as we're raising Kundalini and then releasing as we're releasing?
That is correct. And again, we want to caution people here because everyone's body is a bit different, especially in this timeline. So, to your comfort level, raising that up even slightly, we think, and doing so in combination with the breath, it is what sets the chain of events in motion.
You mentioned earlier at the Bond, we're teaching a meditation practice that didn't involve breathing. So, in relation to the Kundalini we're talking about now, you mentioned that the breath of fire was not necessary, but so what kind of breath is used? Is it just your normal natural breathing, but maybe in conjunction with that, you're pulling up on the perineum as you inhale and then exhale and release?
Correct, correct. And in the practice that you are asking us about, the Buddhist technique, and across the board, even we would say this was a part of many ancient civilizations. There was a pause between the inhale and exhale, and the pause was perhaps one of the most important aspects of the practice because in the pause, we were allowing the body to do the work without the influence of mind. If we were building on that pause, what we would find was eventually our breath would take over and we would not have to work at it at all. We would begin to find this balance between the as above, so below, the divine masculine and the divine feminine, the in breath, the out breath. Now, in the Buddhist practice, the pause in the breath was the focus. We were aiming to pause the breath as long as possible. And in doing so, the breath did not have to exist at all. What you may find in a more traditional Kundalini practice, if you are implementing a pause between the inhale and exhale, is that you will not have to think about the breath anymore. You will fall into a rhythmic practice where it takes a life of its own. And this is ultimately what you are going for. Many believe that they have to follow a certain practice, and in their mind, they are focusing on the in breath and out breath religiously. And in doing so, breaking the connection between the as above and so below. So if we're trying to pull energy upward, certainly for a while, we might need to focus in those lower chakras and we may need to focus on the breath. But once it starts to ascend, what we're going for is a state of non-resistance, a state where we are not attuned at all to the practice. We're allowing the practice to carry us. And it is so easy to let go and feel and assume the Kundalini as a natural part of who we are. It is not something that has to be otherworldly or something that we have to achieve outside of our day-to-day experience. We can become the breath of Kundalini, and that bliss and that energy can follow us into our day-to-day reality.
Are there any other mechanics that are necessary to observe, like position of the tongue or any other bodily structures?
Certainly, these positions were used, various mudras of the fingers, positions of the eyelid, of the eyes behind closed lids, and the pressure of the tongue on the roof of the mouth. And the theory behind these things was that these electromagnetic connections behind the pineal had certain, we'll say, gathering places that would support the Kundalini activation. We don't necessarily think these are necessary, but if you would choose to do them, you could. These practices, obviously, as we've mentioned, were taught completely differently in different civilizations.
And are any visualizations necessary while conducting it, or is this simply the mechanics necessary?
We believe visualization can actually get a bit in the way of the process itself. The best position for you in terms of visualizing is to have a soft focus downward into the body. Even perhaps letting go of any connection to the outer world, where you're focusing downward very softly behind closed lids into the center of your body. And we find, for those of us who have practiced diligently, that just doing that sets off that chain of events automatically. It's somewhat like an automatic button where before we even begin to breathe, we close our eyes and gently focus them downward, and we can already begin to feel the Kundalini energy rising.
So this was a technique that was used or practiced by the ancient Atlanteans, is that, or the Syrians? What's the origin of this
You're
practice?
referring to the Kundalini?
Correct.
This is a cosmic, historic practice, meaning it has begun in star systems beyond the Earth.
And so how do beings who are, well, you said star systems beyond the Earth, how do they practice it, considering all these different beings have different mechanical structures, right? Their physical bodies are different in different dimensions.
Well, this is why we say it is so different. For example, a being that exists in the 12th dimension as a light collective is in a state of Samadhi and Kundalini at all times, because that unification within yourself is the goal of the Kundalini. But in a collective state, if you've reached the 12th dimension, you are always unified. So there's no effort placed on Kundalini at all. But we could take you back, for example, to Pleiades at a time when many of those in that star system were more focused on their spiritual evolution in a way that humans are, and say that their energetic bodies focused or were structured very much like your own. So the focus inward on raising the Kundalini from the chakras, even though they may have been structured a bit physically and non-physically differently than you, was always the same. So chakras, they are galactic centers, which is why we could say this is the similarity of the process. We are raising the Kundalini from the root or the perineum and the sacral and moving it upward. And even those that have transitioned into a more hybrid form have a chakra system, even if that chakra system is a bit more advanced than humans. For example, we have often stated that the chakra system is meant to become a solid core of light, where each chakra that exists individually becomes fused and operative in a unified fashion. And many who experience this are in a constant state of Kundalini because the passage of light and energy between that central channel or meridian is simply so strong. But we could take you into Arcturus, for example, and say at a time when Arcturians preferred to be more physically focused, they used movement as a part of this breath practice. Not necessarily a breath of fire, but more yogic technique than what we have added into the equation. And we know some of that exists on planet Earth, and it does tend to come from Arcturian history. And it helped them because they tend to be not necessarily more physically attuned, but physically attuned to moving energy, in other words. So there are slight deviations, and there has to be. But the commonality, the common thread and the key is the galactic chakra system.
And what would we notice from a practice like this? What were the benefits of it?
What Kundalini will support is a soul's creation into higher dimensions. Because ultimately, the Kundalini, being an elixir, is somewhat like a conscious attunement into the present moment. It heightens your awareness. It helps not only the physical organs and systems to work better, but it blends those physical organs and systems with a more non-physical part of you. You may call it the biofield, for example. And this is where a soul begins to not only see very clearly the geometry that exists within its life, which sometimes you call synchronicity, but also it becomes less reliant on physical effort in order to manifest, because you are using your energy field and your mind and your physical presence in concert with each other. It's somewhat automatic. So in today's reality, many are using programs like law of attraction, for example, to attempt to manifest things that they need. But someone who has raised Kundalini or is practicing Kundalini is more organically attuned to what their soul's divine plan has already brought forth. And in so doing, will exemplify that because there's coherence. And when we speak of coherence, you are existent in a source field that connects to all things. And those things that are meant for you will be prioritized at the time that you need them. But unfortunately, you've been so taken away from truly understanding how this source field works that you negate the very things that show up for you as for you. And in fact, many times they are rejected for one reason or another. Kundalini is not only supportive of the soul's ability to clearly see and choose the things that the source field is activating for them, but also restore and rejuvenate the physical body. So many of you are struggling in physical disease, and certainly there are a great many changes that need to be made on the physical plane. But Kundalini, being an alchemical elixir in ancient times, was used not only for immediate manifestation, but immaculate conception. Immaculate conception is not just the birth of a soul in a physical way. Immaculate conception is the ability to come forth through and of yourself as an expanded version of it. And in plain terms, what this means is you begin to raise your dimension. Everything in your life has to change and upgrade to the consciousness that you assume. And that comes automatically. It comes more easily. It's not that you won't face challenges, but those challenges in a Kundalini state or in a practice like this, they don't feel so hard anymore because you feel and see the support around you. You feel less alone, even if you are not surrounded by physical souls that you feel you need, because ultimately we are all connected in unity consciousness.
How is this different from the 369 that we discussed in earlier conversations? And can you combine the two techniques for more benefits, such as maybe practicing Kundalini in front of a flower of life symbol?
Well, perhaps what we would say is the Kundalini is facilitating or supporting the true physical realization of the 369 that you always exist within, because in so doing, it's bringing your own geometry back into symmetry. And that's where the healthy body extends from. It's where the clear mind extends from. It's where consciousness expands from. Now, certainly in many different applications, this image you speak of was utilized to focus on. As long as the focus or the visualization isn't done in such a way that there is some bias or predetermination of what it is meant to bring in. This is where we think you will put a contradiction in the way of what the Kundalini can provide for you in the way of a 369 connection, which is, remember, an unbroken channel of energy to the greater universe. So if you are using it, do so in non-expectation, in non-judgment, and certainly visualize it as if the breath is bringing you closer to it or you are becoming one with it. This is not required. Many of the renderings of the flower of life, for example, were first created by those who entered a state of Samadhi or a state of Kundalini, where they had the elixir we speak of, which may even be termed today DMT, which is a natural occurring substance in the body, and began to see it expanding outward from their own field. So this rendering, it reminds us of what we are already imbued within, making it a stronger connection to our mind, body, and spirit.
Thank you. And thank you, Michaela.
All right, thank you.
And thank you all for joining us again for another Channel Revelations. We'll be back next week with another Awaken Empowered podcast. And if you would like to listen to us instead of watching YouTube videos, you can also find us on various podcast platforms.